Robert Taylor has lived in Reserve, Louisiana for most of his life. He is in his late 70s now. He was born there, raised there, and his family cemetery is there. His mother died of cancer, so did his sister, so did his uncle, so did his nephew. Standing at that cemetery, he said something that is hard to shake, that all of his folks are there, and that eventually he will wind up there too. There was no crime involved in any of it, no accident, no storm. Nobody in Reserve did anything wrong, and nobody in Reserve failed to notice something they should have noticed. They were breathing. In 2018, the Environmental Protection Agency released data showing that the census tract closest to Robert Taylor's home carried the highest cancer risk from toxic air pollution of any census tract in the United States, roughly 50 times the national average. About 85% of it traced to a single facility, and that is what every place on this list has in common. 11 Deep South communities where the thing that harms people is not the thing anybody watches for, and where the danger arrived by permit, not by accident. Here's the number that should stop you. Alabama has 35 landfills per million residents. New York has 3. California has 5. Coming up, a town living beneath a garbage mountain twice the size of Central Park, a parasite that medicine believed was gone from this country, and a place at number 1 where the entire town was eventually bought and erased. So here's the quiet contradiction at the heart of all 11 of these places. Every one of them looks completely ordinary. Picture the drive the way you would actually make it. 2-lane blacktop, pine and pasture, a Baptist church, a dollar store, kids on bikes, somebody's grandmother on a porch, live oaks, nothing your eyes would flag at any speed. That is exactly the problem. Danger you can see, you slow down for. Ice, fog, a hairpin turn, a construction zone. Your foot moves before your brain finishes the thought. None of these places give you that. The air looks like air. The soil looks like soil. The yard looks like a yard. And here's the one fact I want you to hold on to, because we come all the way back to it at the end. Almost every hazard on this list was legal. Hold on to that one. Let's count it down. Number 11. West Jefferson, Alabama. When I first looked up West Jefferson, I expected a small rural town outside Birmingham, and that is exactly what it is. Here's the wildcard fact. The Big Sky environmental landfill there is permitted to receive up to 25,000 tons of waste a day from 48 states. 48 states, into one small Alabama town. Now here's what people get wrong. Everyone assumes the danger from a landfill is what leaks out of it. Sometimes it is. But residents describe something far more immediate and mundane, an unbearable odor, and flies and stink bugs so thick you could not walk outside without being covered in them. People got headaches. People said they could not breathe. That is not a chemical spill. That is a permit operating exactly as written. A rural road, a quiet county, and the household waste of most of a continent arriving daily. Number 10. Amell, Alabama. When I first found Amell on a map in Sumter County near the Mississippi line, it looked like nothing at all. Farmland, a few houses. Here's the wildcard fact. The hazardous waste landfill outside Amell at one point accepted 40% of all the hazardous waste disposed of in the entire United States, not 40% of Alabama's, 40% of the country's. The neighboring community is around 90% black, and about a third of people live in poverty. And here's the pattern this entry establishes, which runs through everything that follows. Ask why it went there, and the answers are always practical. Cheap land, suitable geology, available permits, somebody willing to say yes. Now ask a harder question. Where is the land cheapest, and where is a yes easiest to obtain? That is not a conspiracy. It is the ordinary logic of siting, applied over decades, and it produces the same map every time. Fertile soil, cheap acreage, and 4 out of every 10 tons of the nation's hazardous waste. Number 9. Anniston, Alabama. When I first read about Anniston, in the northeast corner of the state, one detail stopped me cold. A creek there ran red. Here's the wildcard fact. From 1929 onward, a plant in Anniston manufactured PCBs, industrial chemicals linked to cancers and liver damage. Swan Chemical started it. Monsanto bought the business in 1935. The company disposed of hazardous and non-hazardous waste in landfills next to the facility, and surface water carrying PCBs and other contaminants ran off into ditches and downstream waterways. Anniston residents eventually won a major settlement. It became one of the most prominent environmental cases in the country. Now compare that to every other town on this list, and here is the uncomfortable part. Anniston is the success story. They got lawyers. They got national coverage. They got money. Roughly half the residents are black, and they had enough institutional weight to force an outcome. Most of the places in this video never will. As a Duke law professor put it, there are still major problems in Alabama resulting from environmental injustice, and he tied them directly to the state's history of segregation and voting suppression, which stripped communities of the political power to say no. A Red Creek, a landmark settlement, and the best outcome anybody on this list achieved. Number 8. Brunswick, Georgia. When I first drove into Brunswick on the Georgia coast, I saw marsh grass, shrimp boats, and enormous live oaks. It is beautiful. Here's the wildcard fact. This small coastal city has 4 Superfund sites, including the former LCP Chemicals plant, a property that over decades hosted an oil refinery, a power plant, a paint manufacturer, and a chlor-alkali facility. 4 Superfund sites in one small city. And here's what makes a coastal site different from an inland one. Contamination in a dry landfill largely stays put. Contamination in a tidal salt marsh does not stay put. It moves twice a day, on the tide, into sediment where crabs and shellfish live, in a place where people have fished for generations. The marsh is the thing that makes Brunswick beautiful. It is also the delivery system, shrimp boats, Spanish moss, and 4 federal cleanup sites in a town most people have never heard of. Number 7. Uniontown, Alabama. When I first drove into Uniontown, half an hour west of Selma, the first thing I saw was a hill, a big green one on the edge of town. Here's the wildcard fact. That is not a hill. That is the Arrowhead landfill, an artificial mountain roughly twice the size of Central Park, permitted to accept up to 15,000 tons of waste a day from 33 states. In 2012, the state allowed it to expand by 2/3. 9 out of 10 residents of Uniontown are black. The median household income is around $14,000 a year. And here is why this one is different from every other landfill story. In December of 2008, a containment failure at the TVA's Kingston plant in Tennessee released an estimated 5.4 million cubic yards of coal ash into the Emory River. It was one of the largest industrial spills in American history. Roughly 4 million cubic yards of that ash was put on trains and shipped to Uniontown. Read that again. A disaster happened in Tennessee. The material was removed from Tennessee, and it was relocated to a town in Alabama where 9 in 10 people are black and the grocery store has closed. Residents have spent years describing a rotten egg smell, sore throats, and nosebleeds. The landfill's operator has said no coal ash has been delivered since 2010. One woman who has lived there most of her life put it simply, "The smell makes you want to vomit. The pecan trees do not bear fruit anymore." She stopped using her garden. A green mountain, 33 states, and somebody else's disaster delivered by rail. Number 6. Lowndes County, Alabama. When I first drove the road between Selma and Montgomery, I was on a National Historic Trail. This is civil rights ground. It is also one of the poorest counties in the United States. Here's the wildcard fact. In 2017, researchers from Baylor College of Medicine tested residents here and found that roughly a third of them were positive for hookworm, a parasite that medicine believed had been effectively gone from the United States since the 1980s. Hookworm causes anemia in adults, and in children it causes iron deficiency, cognitive delays, and stunted growth. It is a disease of the developing world. It is used as a measure of whether a country has functioning sanitation. And here is the mechanism, which is soil, not crime. Lowndes County has heavy clay ground that does not drain, which means conventional septic systems fail. Up to 90% of homes have no adequate system. Families who cannot afford a working tank resort to straight piping, running a plastic pipe out of the house and discharging raw sewage onto the ground behind it. The parasite then completes its life cycle in that soil, and the yard becomes the infection route. Now compare that to how you think about your own house. You have never once thought about your sewage because it is the most invisible infrastructure you own. Under Alabama law, residents could face arrest for having an inadequate septic system while being unable to afford one. The Justice Department eventually opened a civil rights investigation into whether sanitation access there was determined by race, historic ground, fertile black soil, and a 19th century disease growing in people's backyards. Number 5. Colfax, Louisiana. When I first read about Colfax in Grant Parish, I assumed I had misunderstood the permit. Here's the wildcard fact. There is a facility outside this small town that disposes of explosives and hazardous waste by burning them in the open air. No incinerator, no stack, no emissions control. Open ground. For years, it operated as the only commercial facility in the country doing it that way. Now here is the myth this breaks. People assume that hazardous waste disposal in a wealthy country is a sealed, high-technology process. Sealed drums, monitored furnaces, scrubbers, permits. Sometimes it is, and sometimes it is a pile in a field and a match. Residents nearby have described the detonations for years, the sound of them, the smoke, and what it does to a person to live with a schedule of controlled explosions somewhere past the tree line. A small parish, open ground, and material nobody else in America would burn that way. Number 4. St. James Parish, Louisiana. When I first drove Louisiana Highway 18 along the west bank of the Mississippi, I was looking at sugarcane and small churches, and then a wall of steel and flare stacks, and then sugarcane again. Here's the wildcard fact. Residents of St. James Parish sued their own local officials, alleging that the parish had repeatedly approved new chemical development in its predominantly black districts. Not a company, their own government. That is what makes this entry structurally different. Everywhere else on this list, the fight is a community against a corporation. Here the claim is about the map itself, about which districts kept getting rezoned for industry and which ones never did. And there is a detail here that is difficult to sit with. This land was plantation ground. Many families along that stretch descend from people enslaved on it, and there are burial grounds of the enslaved on parcels since sold for industrial development. The same acreage used two different ways, a century and a half apart, with the same family standing on it the whole time. Sugarcane, flare stacks, and a lawsuit about who decides where things get built. Number 3, Baton Rouge to New Orleans, Louisiana. When I first drove the river road between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, I stopped counting the plants after about 20 minutes. Here's the wildcard fact. In that 85-mile stretch, there are more than 200 plants and refineries. It has a nickname that residents did not choose and industry does not use. Cancer Alley. And here's what makes the whole corridor so hard to argue about, which is the honest heart of this video. In June of 2025, a fire broke out on a benzene pump at a plant along that river. Black smoke went up. Nobody notified the neighbors. That evening, the parish council announced on social media that there were 0 off-site impacts and released a statement from the plant manager saying fence line monitoring had detected no benzene. Now, hold that next to what independent researchers have measured. A Johns Hopkins team monitoring the corridor found ethylene oxide roughly 9 times higher than the models used by the EPA and Louisiana's own regulator, up to 40 parts per billion near facilities, and concerning amounts more than 6 miles downwind. That is the real fight here. It is not about smoke you can see. It is about whose instrument is believed. 200 plants, 85 miles, and 2 sets of numbers that do not agree. Number 2, Reserve, Louisiana. And number 2 is the town we started in, because it is the single most measured place on this list. When I first drove into Reserve, in St. John the Baptist Parish, it looked like a town of about 10,000 people. Houses, a school, a church. Here's the wildcard fact. The plant on the edge of it is the only facility in the United States producing chloroprene, which the EPA classifies as a likely human carcinogen. DuPont built it in 1968. Denka bought it in 2015. In 2018, the EPA's assessment put the cancer risk in the census tract closest to that plant at roughly 50 times the national average, the highest in the nation, with about 85% traced to that one facility. In 2023, the EPA and the Department of Justice sued, alleging the plant presented an imminent and substantial endangerment to public health and found chloroprene emissions running up to 14 times recommended levels. And here's the detail that should stay with you. Fifth Ward Elementary School sits within about 450 feet of the plant property. Chloroprene is considered especially toxic to children. A study by the University Network for Human Rights found cancer rates within a mile of the plant near 7%, dropping by roughly 40% just half a mile further out. Denka has disputed all of it, calling the EPA's chloroprene science faulty and the resulting risk figure dramatically inflated, and pointing to a state tumor registry it says shows no increase in reserve. Both of those are on the record. The community has been living inside the disagreement for 60 years. An elementary school, 450 feet, and a dispute the residents cannot leave. Number 1, Mossville, Louisiana. And honestly, this is the one that stays with me because you cannot visit it. When I first went looking for Mossville near Lake Charles, I could not find much of it. That is the story. Here's the wildcard fact. Mossville was founded in the 1790s by free people of color, one of the earliest free black settlements in the American South. Families held that land for 2 centuries. Then industry arrived and surrounded it. By the end, the community sat encircled by more than a dozen industrial facilities. And then the town was bought. A petrochemical company purchased the properties and residents relocated, and what had been a 200-year-old community became part of an industrial footprint. Now here's why it is number 1, and it is the thing nobody plans for. Every other place on this list is still fighting. Reserve is in court. Lowndes County has federal investigators. Uniontown has organizers. St. James has a lawsuit. Mossville has none of those because there is no longer a Mossville to have them. A buyout is not a verdict. Nothing was proven and nothing was admitted. The community simply ceased to exist as a place, and with it went the one thing that makes any of these stories possible. A group of neighbors in one location able to say the same thing at the same time. 200 years, 14 plants, and a town that is now a parcel. So here's the actual answer, the one all 11 of these have been building toward. Every danger you naturally respect hands you a signal your body already knows. Ice makes the wheel go light. Fog you can watch closing in. A curve you can see coming. Rain you can hear on the roof. Your foot lifts off the gas before you've consciously decided anything. Not one hazard on this list does that. Chloroprene gives you no smell you would act on. Coal ash gives you a green hill that looks like landscaping. Hookworm gives you a yard that looks like a yard. PCBs gave Anniston a red creek, and even that took decades to mean anything. And a tidal marsh gives you the prettiest view in Georgia. That is the first half of it. The second half is the part that actually explains the map. Almost none of this was illegal. There was no midnight dumping in most of these stories. There were permits, hearings, zoning votes, and signatures. The waste that went to Uniontown went there under a federal agreement with a liner and monitoring after an official analysis of disposal options. Which means the question is never really what happened. It is why it kept happening in the same kind of place. And the answer is not mysterious. Siting follows cheap land, weak opposition, and available permits. Those things are not randomly distributed across the Deep South. They track poverty, and in the Black Belt they track a specific history that stripped whole counties of the political power to refuse. Nobody has to intend that outcome for it to happen every single time. So, if you ever find yourself living near one of these, do the small, unglamorous things. Look up your address on the EPA's public mapping tools before you sign anything. They are free, and they show you what is permitted nearby. Find out whether your water is municipal or a well, and whether your sewage is municipal or septic. Most people genuinely do not know. Go to the hearings. The decisions in this video were made in rooms that were technically open to the public and functionally empty. None of that is exciting. All of it works. Come back one last time to that cemetery in Reserve, Louisiana. An old man standing among his own family, a refinery behind the headstones, saying that all of his folks are there and that he will wind up there too. His mother, his sister, his uncle, his nephew. He is not a statistic, and he is not a symbol. He is a man who has lived in one town for nearly 80 years and buried most of the people he loves in it. And that is the real number here. Not 50 times the national average. Not 450 feet. Not 4 million cubic yards. It is pecan trees that stop bearing fruit. It is a garden somebody stopped planting. It is a church congregation that gets smaller in a way nobody can quite prove. Now remember what I asked you to hold on to. Almost every hazard on this list was legal. That is the whole story. Not one of these towns was attacked. Everyone was chosen, reasonably, on paper, by people applying ordinary criteria in the ordinary way, over and over, until the new map came out looking exactly like the old one. Nothing out there is hunting anybody, and that is precisely what makes it so hard to fight. You cannot sue a trend. You cannot subpoena a preference for cheap land. There is only a process, patient and enormous, that has been running for 80 years and has never once had to break a single rule. And it does not need anybody's permission. It already has it.